And, sometimes there's two different levels of user journeys. Some is the high level, like it could be discover, evaluate, commit, which is great. Those are really strong framings, understand a lot about the user's mental model and, their intent. But I think the thing that is probably most effective for driving alignment is going one level deeper, which is literally capturing every single screen a user hits while performing their top tasks. What does that look like? And for the growth team, you're often focused on broader journeys that are more focused on activation or expansion. And so things like inviting users is kind of a really key task that's really important for expansion. So what are those top tasks? How do you map them? And when you show people what the user journey is, if you use the product a lot, you might be able to have a good intuitive sense, but people rarely will use the product with this much intentionality. So when you do that, suddenly you realize that your onboarding flow has 36 steps. And it's intuitive now that there's areas of opportunity within that key flow.
Welcome to Growth Mates, the place where we connect everyone with inspiring leaders to help you grow yourself and your product. Here you can learn how companies like Dropbox, Mira, Pinterest, Adobe, Atlassian, Amplitude, Canva, and many more are building excellent products and growth culture. Press follow not to miss a new episode. This time we had a conversation with Phil Vander Broek, co-founder at Dopt, previously head of growth and business platform design at Dropbox. We decided to talk about user onboarding and unpack all the truth we know about it. From this episode, you can learn how Dropbox approached user onboarding and what they learned from experimenting with that, how growth and core teams collaboration looked at Dropbox, what rituals can help in building a growth culture, and best practices for user onboarding from research with more than 80 companies. Beyond the Dropbox story, Phil shared his transition to becoming a co-founder at Dopt, and how his design background helped him play a founder role. If you find it valuable, please share it with your network and leave us a good review. To receive all episodes right in your inbox, subscribe to katesuma.substack.com. Last thing before we dive into today's episode, I've got an exciting announcement for you. If you are keen on mastering product growth and user onboarding, join our upcoming course in April. Teaming up with my ex-Mira colleague, we will personally guide you to create a stellar onboarding experience and share the frameworks we've collected for years. For more details and early access, find the link in the episode description. So now, let's dive in. Hi Phil, welcome to Growth Mates. Thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely. Phil, when I was thinking about this season and different topics that I'd like to bring here, user onboarding was absolutely one of them. And thinking about the person who I'd like to talk to about this topic, your name was just immediately appeared in my mind. You've been working at Dropbox, I think, for 3 years, started as a product design manager, and then ended up being a head of growth design and business platform. And then after that, you started your own thing, and it's also purely dedicated to user onboarding. You are creating Dopt, which is a tool that helps companies do some onboarding materials with speed. And I think it's a great mission. So today we would like to focus a lot on this user onboarding topic and all the things we know about user onboarding. But let's start from your time at Dropbox. So when you were there, how did you approach user onboarding over your period of working at Dropbox?
Yeah, like you said, when I was at Dropbox, I started as a product design manager. I was leading the acquisition team, which was responsible for the website and all of very top of funnel. So working with marketing, working with a lot of other teams across the entire business to make sure that the right people are landing in Dropbox, who's the right user, how do they discover and understand what Dropbox is so they can get started. And then by the time, I was the later part of my time there, I was leading all of growth design and business platform. So that was acquisition, activation, and all the later lifecycle parts too. Onboarding at Dropbox was a journey. It was a persistent focus area for us. So over the 3 years that I was there, it was always a priority, and we had tons of experiments, tons of learnings, and tons of complete redesigns. So I feel like for me, it felt like almost my school for what does good onboarding look like, because it was so practical and it was so applied. I think that, one of the key ways we organized ourselves around our users and our business was by dividing our users into two major groups. One was personal users and one was business users. And, Dropbox is broadly applicable to a bunch of different types of users. And typically, that could be someone like a consumer type person who wants to back up their iPhone, anything to more like prosumer, like maybe you're a small agency and you're 3 people and you want to collaborate on shared media files like videos, all the way to some of the biggest companies in the world who have thousands of users and is true kind of like enterprise scale. And so the way we really thought about it was breaking it into personal users, which was more of the either consumer use cases, like mobile was really important for them, and maybe they were collaborating with their family or collaborating with some of the smaller groups. Those are personal use cases, and the business use cases was much more focused on larger team-based experiences where things like admins would be really important. So that was the overall framing for how we approached it.
This is quite interesting that you had this exposure to both B2C and B2B segments while working in one company, while working on these onboarding flows and journeys. Do you remember any sort of surprising behavioral insights that you got from this experimentation on user onboarding? That something really surprised you that you didn't expect, that users, for example, don't understand how to just input their personal data, but they did struggle with that. So any sort of insights about the user behavior?
Yeah, and I really like the question because it talks about behavior first and not what the experiment or solution looks like. And that was the right mindset. And one thing I loved about working at Dropbox is we had a really strong user-centered culture and we had a really strong research team. So especially for growth-oriented projects, we were really focused on thinking about user behavior and doing research, both qualitative and quantitative, to understand what we might work on. So one story I really like about my time at Dropbox was when we looked at kind of the end-to-end user journey, particularly for the business onboarding. We realized that, we thought about what are the core kind of jobs to be done or like top tasks for users. And of course, one of the key things is being able to upload your content and then have shared access to the content. So that could be like, let's say you're working on a presentation with 5 people. You want to make sure that presentation's in the right spot so the right set of people can work on it. And that's amongst a lot of other type of content that has a lot of different type of access. And so we discovered that people just weren't confident in who has access to content in Dropbox, which, as you can imagine, is a major blocker to getting in and getting value from Dropbox and being a long-term happy customer. Some of the problems were like they were afraid of giving the wrong people access to content. They were concerned about sensitive information, and they were also concerned about the overall structure of their content. So some of the key problems were like defining access was challenging, seeing who accessed it was not clear, and managing access was kind of confusing. So it's a lot of kind of like, where do you put the file, who should get it? And the thing that I like about this kind of use case or this kind of growth case study is that a lot of those problems were core product challenges, meaning the business in general was thinking about how to make this easier because it was so important. And, as a growth team, as our job is to help people discover and connect with value, we didn't have the purview or even, it wasn't our job to really make the permission model better. And yet we felt like there was really good opportunities to think about how to onboard users into that kind of permission model and maybe even run some experiments and make some learnings to see how to improve that core model. And so that's kind of what we did. We discovered that users had a bunch of different workarounds, like creating their own separate folders and basically making a bunch of folder structures that didn't end up making sense. And one of the key concepts is that with the business team or business product, you have a shared space that's like your company space, and then you have like personal spaces. Sounds very simple, but it can get really tricky about where do I put what. So we had a hypothesis, or basically like, okay, there's the problem statement. People don't know where to put their content. It's really important that they do that. They achieve that task during onboarding, and it's one of the key aha moments. And so what the team basically did is they came up with a simplified permissions at upload. So rather than when you upload your first file, if you put it into the team space, Dropbox was like, hey, if you put it here, everyone gets it. So if you don't want to do that, cancel this and go figure out where you want to put it. And basically people were like, wait a minute, I don't understand. I don't quite understand if I put it here, who gets it. I don't understand if I should cancel now and go somewhere else. So the experiment was basically when you upload a folder, it will, rather than saying, just so you know, more like an information or a warning, it actually exposed two different options. You could either put it into your team space and it told you who had access to the team space, or you could put it into, it basically was like, who do you want to share this with? So it kind of flipped it on its head about rather than where do you want to put it, or like, let's put it on the onus on the user to figure out this whole kind of crazy hierarchy of folders. It's basically like, do you want to put it for everyone, or do you want to share it with specific people? And I love that because it was really an entry point into who should see this types of content rather than an informational warning that makes the user go on a crazy path. And it didn't change the underlying access model. It was really just a really important, like a really smart entry point within the user onboarding. And what the really cool part was, this only addressed single folder uploads on web on the root folder. So it's really a targeted experience. You know, people are uploading stuff all over the place and they're uploading a bunch of different content. So it's a strong hypothesis. Okay, let's just see if when people have single folders on web, on the root folder, if we can have a better experience for them. It was like extremely successful. People had a much, that basically converting to like how many people uploaded content. It worked much better. So there's the learning. And I'll just say one more thing. A valid learning that there's opportunity to improve the permission model and basically leading into the question, how might we explore a vision for a simplified system for managing access in Dropbox, which is cool because I love that growth can power that type of insight.
I really do hope that this insight will resonate to so many products that have this level of complexity and, you know, like access management and all of these complexities within these products, because I personally even had these situations when we struggled with that. To summarize what you did from the UX perspective, you made it more transparent for user what is happening when they are uploading these files. And my assumption is that users in the end, they felt a little bit more safe and in control of what is happening with their files. They are not getting like exposed to the hundreds of other people. If they become in a public space, they can choose what is happening. And probably it's also about our responsibilities as everybody who is working on these solutions to remember this power of defaults, because sometimes this default path that we are proposing to users who are creating an account, just creating a new file, can be dangerous for them. And we just need to be transparent. We don't need to change the whole logic behind that, but we need to be very transparent about what is happening. So I think this is a great insight for our listeners on what they can do and what they can check if their flows are transparent and if their flows are user-friendly in the end and ethical, because we want to create good products. This is awesome. And you've mentioned this interesting thing that you uncovered, that improvement that was within the scope or within the responsibility of the core team. And how did you end up aligning between the growth part and core team? Or you worked together solving this problem eventually? Because the growth and core team collaboration is one of the most frequently asked questions, I think. Yeah,
and that can be really hard. And there's a lot of challenges about good communication and ownership and collaboration. For this one, I would say almost like together but separate. And by that, I mean, we had since this experience was somewhat removed into the onboarding flow, we had the ability to run experiments on our own. And so it was in our complete purview to build something like this. And when we ran it and we had learnings, we shared those back into the core team. And the core team had already been working on some key kind of model improvements. It had been a long-term initiative. And so in that sense, the collaboration worked pretty seamlessly because we were able to say, y'all are doing the right thing. And also here's a really solid experiment. Maybe this can inform some of the model changes that you're thinking about.
Yeah, that's great. And did you have any formal rituals or any sort of rituals that help you connect between core and growth, or any other rituals in growth team that you'd like to highlight as an advice to some other teams who are early in their journeys on building the product-led growth team and trying to figure out what should we do to stay aligned and how to build this culture?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are two main practices we used to help with both communicating broadly, but also kind of setting a vision for and kind of framing opportunities and solutions within the growth team. The first one is, and some of these are fairly like well-known or established practices, but to really do it and be intentional about it and use it to its fullest extent, I think is still kind of an ongoing opportunity for most growth teams and even some core product teams. And the first one is creating end-to-end user journeys. And I think the key here is to not get lost in all of the noise that a product has, because products are super complex. There's an infinite number of flows. Oftentimes there's kind of like reoccurring loops, and it's easy to be like, making user journeys is too hard. The main important thing for a growth team is to understand what a user's key jobs to be done are, or you can call them like a top tasks and or use cases. I think those are oftentimes quite synonymous. And then making sure everybody has a shared idea about what those top tasks are, and then literally creating what the canonical user experience is across those. And sometimes there's two different levels of user journeys. Some is the high level, like it could be discover, evaluate, commit, which is great. Those are really strong framings, understand a lot about the user's mental model and their intent. But I think the thing that is probably most effective for driving alignment is going one level deeper, which is literally capturing every single screen a user hits while performing their top tasks. With the website, that's often like lands on the home screen and is gonna, discover and evaluate and buy Plus plan and then Pro plan. In the product, that's going to be like personal user lands and needs to onboard. Or some of the core tasks would be like, user needs to upload a file. What does that look like? And for the growth team, you're often focused on broader journeys that are more focused on activation or expansion. So things like inviting users is kind of a really key task that's really important for expansion. So what are those top tasks? How do you map them? And when you show people what the user journey is, if you use the product a lot, you might be able to have a good intuitive sense, but people rarely will use the product with this much intentionality. So when you do that, suddenly you realize that your onboarding flow has 36 steps. And it's intuitive now that there's areas of opportunity within that key flow. And, usually for something like onboarding, everybody knows activation is one of the key metrics that drives the business forward. So, wow, onboarding has 36 steps. Did everyone know that? People would be like, no. Okay, cool. Now we have a good conversation. Be like, how can we make this better? And you can overlay things like problem statements. And eventually you can overlay opportunities. You can overlay research. You can overlay quantitative data. And you can really use this to, I'll give you one quick case study. We did this with the website. We basically had noodle graphs, and, they would be tons of different touch points, tons of different quantitative data, tons of different little customer quotes. And we would go and work with marketing, and we would go and work with core product, and we would all look at these journeys together. And then we could work with marketing, and we could say, hey, what kind of positioning or messaging updates do we need to work on here? Okay, cool. Like, they're going to own what the top 3 messaging statements are over there, but we're going to own the key design for how a user flows. And then, hey, core product, just so you know, this type of user is going to land in onboarding. They landed on, let's say, an ad, or they clicked an ad, they landed on a SEM page, and now they're going to onboard. Okay, that user has a different level of intent because they have, let's say it was a use case focused landing page. Okay, we know what that user's use case is. Maybe it's upload photos. Hey, core product team, this person cares about uploading photos. What's their journey look like? Oh, you put them into being collaborative. That's not their job to be done. So, but this kind of like visualizing who the user is across the flow, and then using that to drive alignment, and then also raise a problem and opportunities was really, really effective for us. And I think product's really complex. The organization is really complex. Who owns what can be challenging. So this was just like a really simple and effective tool to get people on the same page.
This is great mental model as well, to think of user journeys instead of just simple personas or features, and keep journeys in mind rather than this flat structure of the products in your head. And to create this mentality inside the company, it's very powerful. One question that I have about that, based on my experience and people who I talk to, how did you make sure that these user journeys became actionable and actually living assets rather than just static things you've created and they are just living on a board or anywhere else where you created them and nobody is revisiting them and they are just beautiful? And how did you make sure that they are actionable, that they are being revisited in certain amount of time?
Yeah, great question. And it's so hard. And I don't think we were perfect at this. I think if you were to talk about what an ideal growth practice is, you would keep this as a foundational part of the way you work, and you would do it it could be, let's say, on a quarterly basis, just because the product continues to evolve and you want to be able to understand what the user journey is. And again, this is more like a strategic foundational input that should inform, let's say, like a quarterly or a yearly or a half-year plan. And it shouldn't be reactive. It shouldn't be like, now that we know we're working on Project X, let's go see what that user journey is. I would say at Dropbox, we're a little bit mixed. And there's good opportunity to do better here. But sometimes it was project-based, which was fine. But I think we did do a good job when we were doing major resets, like when we were doing a major revamp of the website. One of the first things we did was sketch out just kind of like noodle diagram. Or when we were sometimes... when team structures would change, that would be a good moment to get back to, the fundamentals. And just so, again, that's a moment of uncertainty. And this type of practice is one of the best tools to like help people get aligned and bring certainty. So that was another kind of critical moment where I think this would come into play. So I feel like those are some of the moments we would reach for this practice. But I think in general, it should be, again, more like a foundational growth practice and not driven by any sort of product or project.
Totally makes sense. I think we covered quite a lot of parts from your Dropbox experience, and I'd like to expand a bit more towards like onboarding as an industry and talk a bit more about that, because you have so many insights. Creating a tool for that, you talk to so many other companies and leaders who are solving similar problems on user onboarding. It would be great to get your insights on some industry trends that you've noticed in the last maybe month. I also know that you created this beautiful summary playbook and feature different companies there. So let's talk about that, and I will also share some of my fresh insights. Looking at the onboarding, let's maybe focus more on B2B segment. Where do you see the main challenges are happening right now, or what trends do you see right now in this segment?
Yeah, and I'm really excited to hear about your learnings too, because I know you're working on some, you've collected some insights about onboarding. So a little bit of context, after Dropbox, I started a company called Dopt, and Dopt is basically a developer-first product adoption platform, so you can build onboarding education announcements more easily with SDKs and APIs. And through the process of founding Dopt, I've talked with hundreds of teams building onboarding and other types of growth experiences. So I think that, combined with my experience at Dropbox, has given me a little bit of like a good purview into what's going on in the industry. I've also connected with some other industry leaders. So that product onboarding playbook that you talked about, I worked with you, of course, but I also worked with Lauren, the head of growth at Notion, Gaurav, the head of growth at Superhuman, and Jamie, the head of growth at, the head of product at Loom. So other people who are really embedded in the kind of like B2B growth world. And from that, I feel like I really felt like there was a couple things emerging. One is people often just don't know what good onboarding looks like, and they don't know where to start. And that's interesting because activation is, again, known to be basically the most important metric to drive a B2B SaaS business forward. So there's this like cognitive dissonance. It's like, okay, this is the most important thing for your business. And, people have built in products for decades. And yet there's kind of like a vacuum for what good looks like or how to approach it. Like what a good practice is. And I think that my main question was why? And one of the biggest reasons is that every product is unique and every product has unique users. I mean, there's definitely some commonality, like maybe you're in the productivity space and you're gonna have some commonality. But in general, your product has a different set of feature functionality or value props, and you have specific sets of users you're targeting. So that's the kind of core ingredients to determine what good onboarding looks like. And then you're kind of in your own world. And the same way that every product is different, activation, what is activation, is different for every team. It's so hard. A lot of people get lost in defining an activation metric the same way a lot of people get lost in determining what good onboarding looks like. I think a lot of the conversation within the onboarding world to this point has been modality based. Should I use a checklist or should I use a tooltip? Which really misses the point. I'll give you one good example. We were working with a customer and they were like, we just built a checklist, but it didn't work. So now I don't know what to do. And in my mind, I was like, well, I have just so many questions. Like, what was in the checklist? Who are your users? What behaviors are you trying to drive? So when I kind of like made that assessment and wanted to, especially from my time at Dropbox, bring a set of best practices to the industry that could help guide people through this maze. And one of the things I was most excited about the playbook is that it really starts from first principles. Some of the first principles are kind of what I talked about before. You need to understand your users. Who are the different types of users you have? What are their key tasks, like I talked about before? And then, what's their level of intent? Those are kind of the key 3 ingredients. Then you can look at other experiences in the world to get some good ideas, but you really want to focus on, the modality part is important so you can learn, checklist works well for productivity apps. It's like maybe one good insight. But you also want to look at like how directive is their experience? How much hand-holding do they do? How much can a user just explore? How do they tailor or personalize the experience? So those types of foundational insights can help guide you. And then mapping the end-to-end journey and seeing where you have different opportunities. So those are some of the first principles, that I think, for example, working with this customer, it was like, I tried a checklist and it didn't work. Like, okay, so what should we do? Okay, let's go back to basics and really think about those first principles as an input to how you might proceed. And then the second part is, so those are kind of first principles, is really a growth mindset. And, for you and I, like you and Miro and me and Dropbox, this is not anything new because we have mature growth practices. But a lot of companies in the world either haven't done growth or haven't really embedded themselves in what like solid growth practices look like. And the main thing there is really focusing on learning and iteration. Again, going back to this case study, like we built a checklist and it didn't work. But, well, what did you learn? Why didn't it work? Have you talked to users who didn't activate or who did activate? What type of users are they? How might we use that learning moment to fuel more iteration? Because we know activation is going to be the most important thing. So I feel like that's the type of mindset where those first principles and a learning mindset can really help unlock what good onboarding looks like. And then, the playbook gets into more kind of nuts and bolts about the different patterns you can use when and where. And I think the key here is it gets into modalities, but I really wanted to focus on when specific modalities can work well, why they're useful, and the drawbacks. So you can have a little bit of a playbook about, should I use an interactive tutorial or should I use embedded tips or should I use a checklist, and not just like, you're building SaaS, let's go with a checklist.
Yeah, I really love this idea of getting back to the user, getting back to foundations. And I assume like a lot of products are a bit too radical about solutions. So if checklist didn't work, they just kill the checklist and create tooltips. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. You can iterate on a checklist with the content, with the personalization, with the moment when you show this checklist. So many things. Please don't kill checklists. So keep them. And I think my insights that I got from this industry research, we talked to 80 plus companies from both B2B and B2C, and some patterns are the same. So first of all, activation definition is very challenging. And there are plenty of materials like Reforge courses that can help teams define activation. And it's an art and it takes a lot of time. And I would suggest anyone who is struggling with onboarding process, just ask yourself if you have definition of activation, or maybe invest some time into that, even a quarter, to properly define this metric. And also in terms of actual UX patterns, my insight was that the solution is not to find one perfect pattern or checklist versus tooltips, but use the variety of learning styles for different purposes, for different user journeys. All people, they have different mental models, and not stick to one solution forever. And also another challenge that I noticed is for some B2B companies, which are quite complex, the time to value is quite long. So it's impossible for users to experience this value in the first session. And sometimes some companies are measuring the success of onboarding based on the first session or first week retention, and it doesn't make sense sometimes for B2B companies of complexity, like, for example, Amplitude, when you need not just the user activation, you need your team activation. And this is when you shared your Dropbox experience, when you defined personal situation and personal onboarding, and then business and like team onboarding, because these things should be measured differently. And I believe team activation and team onboarding is another topic and level of complexity to understand. But this is definitely very interesting one. I hope when we will launch this episode, our research study will be already published. It is called onboard.report. And it's a collection of our insights in quite easily digestible manner. It will be a website, and easy to share with the team, easy to get back to. So I hope it will be useful for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's those kind of key insights you have, I completely agree with. I've lived through some of those challenges, like defining activation at Dropbox. And furthermore, I think the product-led onboarding playbook, particularly when I was working with, like Lauren, Gaurav, and JD, I was really curious about how they thought about like their aha moment and also coming up with their activation moment. And Gaurav in particular had some really great insights about keeping it simple at first and really focusing on, retention, especially if you're an early stage company, because activation is just, you might not have enough volume. You also might not just know enough about user behaviors. And I really liked his framework for saying like, focus on retention, come up with a good hypothesis, but then like move forward and start to make progress. Don't overcomplicate it. Like, you'll probably know what the key actions are well enough that you can get going. Start your learning journey, and as you mature, you can do more like, does activation actually correlate, with retention, which is kind of, the holy grail. So I feel like, to your point, same with like some of these challenges, same, you could say with team activation, I like the perspective that you can start simple and go on a learning journey in each of those domains.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great tag, because sometimes I think we need to talk about particular companies differently and different segments differently. So activation definition is for companies who reached already product market fit, and they are more or less confident about their personas, their use cases, because you need to understand certain actions and certain use cases you want to optimize for in order to build this activation funnel and metric. If you are not sure about that yet, then it's not a good moment to invest into that heavily. So you're absolutely right on that. I think as we spent the majority of this episode talking about user onboarding, I finally would like to talk a little bit more about you and your interesting transition, which is actually quite inspirational for me as well. Like, how did you have this courage to start your own thing after being in a, I suppose, comfortable, but actually sometimes full-time job is not also too comfortable. I would like to ask you about this transition and tell us also a bit more about Dopt, if you want, and how you even ended up creating the product and dedicating yourself fully to this new world of being a co-founder.
Yeah, and I will say that my experience as a designer and as a kind of growth practitioner are two really important inputs into being, I think, the kind of entrepreneur I am. And the role that set me up to be an entrepreneur the most is my time at Dropbox, because there's so many parallels between being a growth practitioner and being an entrepreneur. And I'll talk about a couple of those. But for me, I had been broadly interested. I mean, in general, as a designer, I was always interested in the business and product and marketing. And that's why I enjoyed growth as a designer. So I had a lot of like natural curiosity. I had worked as a designer in residence at Sutter Hill Ventures. So, being in the entrepreneurial world, I had been at early stage companies. So entrepreneurship was always interesting to me. It kind of hit a point where I felt like it was now or never. And I left Dropbox. And I have two close friends, my co-founders, and we had all kind of agreed that like, we're going to do it. I had left Dropbox and we thought we were going to build a collaboration app. And we had probably done maybe 15 user interviews and thought we were onto we had a unique insight. About 2 weeks later from leaving Dropbox, we realized there was no opportunity here. So I had this like major oh crap moment. Like, what did I just do? I liked my job at Dropbox. Where am I going to go now? And what happened next, I think, was really instructive because kind of went from zero to like, how do you start a startup in the course of, a couple months? And I think the story that's most interesting is I talked with a bunch of other entrepreneurs and a bunch of other advisors about like, what should we do? And we kind of went back to basics, and our process kind of played out in 3 different phases to determine that we were going to build Dopt. And the first one was just like straight up discovery, where what is a problem in the world that people have that is valuable enough for us to solve. And then the second one was, okay, what's the solution look like, our hypothesis? And wrapped up into that was kind of like, who's our ICP? And those kind of happen all at once, but it kind of more or less in 3 ways. It took us about 9 months to really have an idea about what Dopt was. So that first stage, like, what's a problem in the world? We literally just said, I was talking with someone I worked with at Dropbox named Scott Woody, who started another company, and we got coffee, and he was basically like, well, listen, you got to find like a change in the world and then see if there's an opportunity in that. I love Dropbox. The change in the world we thought was going to happen as product-led growth is going to continue to grow. So we basically started, and luckily it's a good fit because I had a really strong product-led growth network from being on the growth team at Dropbox. And then that growth team kind of went to all these other product-led growth companies. So half of this summer, which was summer of 21, I literally spent basically cold outbounding people. Be like, I am an entrepreneur. I'm Phil. I used to lead growth design at Dropbox. I'm an entrepreneur. I want to start a company like in the product-led growth. You seem like an expert. Will you talk with me? That was like literally half of my summer. The other half was talking to those people and just running discovery. A great book for this is The Mom Test, but especially from a design background, no stranger to research. And it's basically like, what's someone's top 3 problems? You're a product-led growth practitioner. What are the top 3 problems? Because if it's a top 3 problem, it will be a burning need. And the only way you can start a company is if someone has a burning need. One of those problems was onboarding or activation. And so coming from growth at Dropbox, it was like, yes, totally understand. It's really hard. So there's the problem. And there was probably about 40 conversations with varying levels of like product managers, engineers, some marketers. So we didn't really know who, but we were casting a wide net. So, okay, there's a problem. Well, what solutions exist in the world? Okay, there's a bunch of products called digital adoption platforms that are built for product managers that let you, with no-code tools, drag or drop in like checklists and tooltips. There's like 25 of those companies. So there's an established market, but there's universal discontent. People just don't like them for various reasons. They only offer you specific modalities, and kind of like we talked about before, that's constraining. They're brittle. They keep engineers out of the loop. There's not a lot of visibility. They're also just like hard to use, and they don't work with your current product. Like if you have a design system, they won't work with it because you have to redefine everything. So, we were like, oh, okay, there's a problem. There's an existing market, but low NPS. So, so customer owns the problem. Entrepreneurs own the solution. We started to do some hypotheses about what solution might work. And through various iterations and various kind of back and forths, the opportunity we really identified was, could we solve that problem in a different way and focus on developers as our ICP, which is ideal customer profile. And with those 2 building blocks, here's the problem. Our persona is a developer. What does a solution even look like? And over the next, maybe 6 months, we did a lot of prototyping, talking with customers. What's really interesting about being like an entrepreneur is like you kind of mix discovery and development. because you really want to sell product to people. So it's like, hey, can you give us some feedback on this thing? By the way, is this such a problem that you want to partner with us and buy our product as we start to build it? So I love the idea of learning about users and also determining if you can sell to them to learn if you have a viable business, which is a little bit different than most kind of design research practitioners, practices, because it's much more entrepreneurial. You're really seeing if you can build a business. And I would say like the frame that was so useful for me here was Mike Maples, who is a VC at Floodgate, has as my favorite framework for starting a company. And it's basically like, you have to be apples to oranges. You have to be so different that you can't even compare yourself to existing solutions, such that, because you're starting from nothing, you're never going to win against incumbents. If you're selling the same thing, they're going to be able to spend more money. They have more resources. So you have to be so different that they basically, your customer just disqualifies anything else. And then it's you versus nothing. And that's what really, I think, Dopt is, because the customers we talk to basically say, like, we don't want to use any of those other tools. So that whole category is disqualified, but we still have this onboarding problem and we don't want to build it ourselves. You're a startup. People can be a little bit scared of working with startups for all the reasons you might expect. We're small, we're unproven, things like that. But it's such a burning need. Like, the pain has to be so astronomical and it has to be now. So it's a top 3 problem that they'll choose to work with you and take a bet on you. And so that apples to oranges kind of analogy that Mike Maples does a phenomenal job framing up was really instrumental for us to go from like, oh, this is a bet. We feel like this can be a venture-backed startup because we have the right ingredients of a top 3 problem with a, apples to oranges kind of value prop positioning for building for developers. And then, of course, all the benefits are like, you can build the exact experience you want. It can be completely embedded. It can leverage your design system. It works with all your other tools, things like that as kind of the key differentiator. So that's a little bit of the case study about how we went from zero to like Dopt's an idea.
This is so exciting and so inspirational. I wanted to ask you what helped you from your design background to become a founder, but after listening to you, I actually got an insight about that, because you said as a founder, as an entrepreneur, you are combining both discovery and building. And this is exactly what you are doing at a full-time job as a designer, especially in the growth field. Like, you're also very attached to the business, and being having an experience across different parts of the funnel, you just apply these tactics to your new product or to yourself to grow anything you want.
Exactly
actually.
that.
Yeah.
This
is super
that's
cool.
so right. And I think for me, growth was about being an entrepreneur. It's just a learning journey. And you just have to be like a sponge, and your velocity of learning is what makes the difference to determine if you're on the right track. And I think growth is really the same way. And what I love about growth, and I love about being an entrepreneur, is, yeah, you're learning about your product, but you're also learning about your users. You're learning about the market. You're learning about your business, like what's the right pricing model, again, which is very much a growth-oriented thing. I love thinking broadly like that. And then obviously as a designer, you're very customer-centered. You're thinking about end-to-end users' journeys, and you're very product-centered, which are also important attributes. But that kind of mix has really, really been fun for me to apply to being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and actually this leads us to the final part of this conversation, the lightning round. And the typical first question that I usually ask there is, what is your recent learning that maybe shifted your perspective already as a founder? Anything comes to your mind?
I guess my main insight is I've been on a little bit of a learning journey about AI, and I bet that's not uncommon for a lot of people in the world. And I've been curious about the opportunity for AI in onboarding. And I think there's a couple different things that have been useful for me. We hosted some dinners with PLG leaders, and I had an opportunity to talk to different people about, one of my main questions I was ready with was like, are you thinking about AI? And how do you think about AI into your world? And there's a range of different answers, but I felt like I've been auditing onboarding for AI tools to see how they do onboarding. And I've also been planning on writing about it, but it's kind of interesting because my learning has been like, at first I thought I was going to audit AI tools to think about the onboarding patterns they have. Lo and behold, they don't have that many onboarding patterns. So then I was going to say like, wow, I think AI tools have an onboarding problem. which they very well might. I think that's probably still quite true, that activation in particular. I know that there's a retention problem. But then when I was talking with some other people who felt like, especially with prompt-based AI, in many ways that is part of the onboarding. And what's interesting is that it does a really good job of capturing intent. And so it can help users go from 0 to 0.5, not all the way to like the aha moment. But I feel like for me, that's almost like a templates like pattern. How do you think about the different types of use cases a user has and help them go from 0 to 0.5? Prompt-based AI, kind of same deal, like what's my intent? And then how do you help user get through the first couple of hoops to get them on their journey? So now it's kind of like, well, actually onboarding is AI, but it's not the full solution. And I'm really curious about how this will evolve from a patterns perspective. And I'm really curious about the product opportunities. So that's like a synthesis. It didn't come from one reading an article. It came from doing some exploration and talking with some people and playing with some products. But that's shifted my perspective.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is quite provocative topic. Still, this connection of AI and expectations of users towards interfaces. It appeared on my mind, the insight from this onboarding study we did, that somebody mentioned that we noticed that users are expecting the AI will do the whole job for them, and they don't want to invest their time, their effort into like education about this tool. And it's interesting to see how this AI in the world will change the mental model of users, and if it will be dramatic change for us to operate with. And it's very, very interesting to see. Anyways, getting back to lightning round.
I agree.
Second question. Do you have any favorite example of user onboarding? Maybe a product, recent example that you really liked?
Such a good question. Maybe one thing I'll do is, rather than choosing a particular product, I'll choose a pattern that I thought was kind of cool. And I'm kind of always auditing onboarding, but recently, especially for the playbook, I did a concerted effort to see what the different types of patterns are. And there's one that I'm calling interactive guides, but this isn't like, there's no term in the industry that covers it, where basically if you're a tool that has a really directed type of, you don't have a lot of different jobs to be done. It's not like a productivity app where you have maybe a lot of different templates. You have like really one core workflow. There's an opportunity to make a cool, almost like game-like experience where you help users interactively learn how to use that core product or core interaction model. And it's funny because this is not super new. I think maybe the first one that comes to mind is Superhuman, where, they kind of like really brought the idea of Command K and like power user hotkeys into the core interaction model. And then when you onboard, they're like, hey, hit Command K. And then also they have this little journey that's like, here's your inbox, hit JJ to go down, hit KK to go up. Like, I can't even remember all the hotkeys to like clear out. And it really borrows from games like, the best examples, like Cut the Rope. The first level, you just have a rope. And you're like, well, the only thing I can do is hit the rope. Oh, cool, you cut the rope. That's the key mechanism. And then they introduced little like next levels where it's like you can bounce the ball. And Superhuman in this kind of interactive guide does the same thing. And I've noticed some other people all kind of employ that. I know that like one little slice of Intercom's onboarding is like that. What's interesting, Retool used to have that pattern, but they ripped it out. So I would love to know more about their learnings about why. And they're a little bit more of a horizontal platform, so maybe it was too directive for their, like maybe templates would be a better pattern for them. But, for products that have like, again, like core workflow, like Superhuman, I need to like do emails. That's all. They can create a kind of cool sandbox world, almost like make it more like a game. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space.
Yeah, sure. The first question, I actually didn't want to ask it because it's so provocative, but if you'd had just one option, what would you choose, tooltips or checklists? I have to ask it.
Well, this is funny because this goes against exactly what we were talking about before, that it's like the modality is one thing amongst the sea of many considerations for good onboarding. But, I feel like I read this in the playbook. Tooltips is the pattern that everyone loves to hate just because they're so annoying because they're just used poorly. And so I can't pick tooltips because checklists are you can embed a checklist. A checklist can be focused on the whole end-to-end user journey. It's much more, checklist isn't right for everything, but I would choose in general.
Let's keep checklist. And for folks who wanted to kill their checklist to iterate on something, please keep checklist, iterate on checklist. It's worth it. Last thing, maybe you have any resources that you recently read, books, anything like that inspired you on the topics that we discussed today, connected to onboarding or connected to your transition to entrepreneurial role. So yeah.
Oh yeah. Maybe when this goes live, we can share the product-led onboarding playbook. Also, you can find it on Dopt's blog. But each section has an article that I felt like was the best practices for that section. In particular, I'll highlight maybe two articles that I thought were great. One, Lenny's newsletter has a great blog post about how to define an activation metric. And it gets back to that, this is a really hard problem. So can get some good insight there. Secondly, Elena Verna, I believe is her last name, has a great article about user to team to business level activation. And what you said earlier is a lot of companies don't focus on team or business activation in those different levels. I believe she calls it the monetization elevator. Both of those frameworks, activation and how to think about user, team, and company, were really great. On the entrepreneurial side, I can't remember where, and I can dig this up and we can share it out, but somewhere Mike Maples talks about that framework for starting a company. And I love it. I think it's the best framework to apply to, is this a business I want to spend time trying to build because it's enough of an opportunity?
We'll try to find it and attach it to the description, so it will be super useful. And +1 to the Lenny's and Yelena resources. These are must-haves for anyone who is diving into product-led growth. So thanks a lot, Phil, for joining me today on this episode. I really, really enjoyed this conversation and diving that deep into onboarding. I don't feel tired talking about that. I think I can talk about that forever. Yeah, so where folks can find you, LinkedIn or any other place where it's best to stay in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter. On LinkedIn, it's Phil Vander Broek. It's a full name. Maybe we can put the link in the thing. And then on Twitter, it's Phill VB. And those are the areas where I share things about growth and product-led growth and onboarding and Dopt.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Phil, for joining us today. It was fantastic, and I hope it will be useful for our listeners.
I hope it's useful too, and thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. If you found it valuable, you can support GrowthMates by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Subscribe to our show on your favorite platforms and get all episodes to your inbox by subscribing to katesuma.substack.com. Let's keep growing together.